The accusation began with a whisper in a Seville alley at dusk. A man in a plain woolen tunic leaned close to a hooded figure. He didn't speak a crime, he spoke a name, Alonso de la Cruz. Then he was gone, melting into the shadow of a whitewashed wall. The hooded figure, a familiars of the Inquisition, did not follow. His job was to listen. He walked 20 paces to the church of San Pedro and stopped before a small wooden box nailed to the heavy oak door. It was called the Caja de Denuncias, the denunciation box. He slipped a folded note through the slot. The sound was a dry scrape on bare wood. No one saw him do it. Inside the note, written in a hand that deliberately slanted, were 8 words. He does not eat pork. He prays in secret. That was enough. In 1481, under the new authority of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, this was not gossip. It was evidence. The crime was Judaizing, the suspicion of practicing Judaism in secret. The punishment, if proven, was death. Think about that for a moment. The feeling of a rumor starting at work or in a neighborhood, except here it could get you arrested on a capital charge. The system was designed for anonymity, and that made it terrifying. You didn't need proof, you needed only suspicion or malice or a neighbor's envy over a successful business. At midnight, a different man came for the box. He was a clerk, his fingers stained with ink. He worked in a room lit by a single candle in a building that bore no official seal. Here, the note was unfolded, smoothed, and read. A quill was dipped on a ledger page under the heading Denuncias Recibidas. He wrote, Alonso de la Cruz, Mercer, Calle de la Sierpe. The ink was black and precise. This was the true genius and the horror of the Inquisition's machinery. It turned a whisper into a file, a private grudge into state business. Alonso de la Cruz, a seller of fine cloth, was now a line in a secret book. He would wake the next morning, brew his tea, and open his shop, completely unaware that the gears had begun to turn. His name was now separated from the community, isolated on parchment, waiting for the next phase. The clerk sanded the page, closed the ledger, and blew out the candle. The room plunged into a darkness that was not empty but full of names. Alonso's was just one. Dozens were added every week in Seville alone. This was not yet an arrest. It was a seed planted in the dark that would grow into a warrant, a midnight knock, and a cell with no windows. And the man who had whispered? He was already asleep, his conscience clear. He had done his duty to God and the crown. The machinery once set in motion required no further effort from him. It would run on its own grim momentum, fueled by fear and the absolute certainty of its own righteousness. What happened next to Alonso would depend on questions asked in rooms without light and answers extracted by means the manual called necessary persuasion. The knock came just before dawn. 3 sharp raps on a heavy oak door on the Calle de la Sierpe in Toledo. The sound was official, impersonal, a punctuation mark in the silent hour. Inside, Alonso de la Cruz, the mercer, was pulling on his boots. He paused. His wife, Maria, froze at the hearth, a clay bowl in her hand. Outside stood 2 men. They were not soldiers. They wore long black cloaks of coarse wool, stark against the whitewashed wall. These were familiares, lay assistants of the Holy Office. Their authority was greater than any constable's. One held a lantern, its flame guttering in the cold air. The other held a folded parchment sealed with red wax. Alonso opened the door. He saw the black cloaks first, then the faces beneath the wide-brimmed hats. They were not unkind faces. They were empty of expression altogether. Alonso de la Cruz? The question was a formality. They knew. I am he. The second man unfolded the parchment. He did not hand it over. He held it up so the lantern light fell upon the script. It was a warrant of arrest, signed by the Inquisitor General. The charge was written in a clear clerical hand, sospecha de judaizante, suspicion of Judaizing. The crime of his secret prayers, of his avoidance of pork, had been given a legal name. You will come with us. This is the moment that changes everything. The sudden official knock, the presentation of a signed order, the world narrowing to a single command. There were no rights explained, no lawyer requested, no moment to prepare a defense. The modern parallel is stark, but in 1481 there was no parallel at all. There was only the warrant and the two men in black. Alonso turned to look at Maria. Her face had gone the color of ash. She took a step forward, but one of the familiares moved, just slightly, blocking the doorway with his body. You may bring a cloak, nothing else. He was not permitted to touch her. He was not permitted to speak to his children, who were now awake and crying in the loft above. He was a line in a ledger, and lines do not say goodbye. He took his heaviest cloak from a peg. Maria's hand darted out, clutching at his sleeve. Her fingers were white. One of the men gently, firmly pried them loose. They led him out into the street. A simple wooden cart waited, hitched to a single mule. The driver did not turn around. Alonso was helped into the back, a courtesy, not a kindness. The cart was empty save for a few strands of old straw. He looked back at his doorway. Maria stood there, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other gripping the doorframe as if the world were tilting. The lantern light from the familiares caught the tears on her cheeks but did not soften them. Then the man in black closed the door. The sound was final, a household severed. The mule driver clicked his tongue. The cart wheels groaned against the cobblestones, beginning the slow roll through the waking city. They did not head for the public jail. They turned toward a nondescript building near the cathedral, a place with thick walls and no signs, a secret prison. Alonso sat in the cart, watching the familiar streets of Toledo pass as a spectator. The bakery where he bought bread, the fountain where his children played. Each one a landmark receding into a past that was already being sealed away from him. Inside the house, Maria slid to the floor, the bowl shattered beside her. The accusation had been a whisper. The arrest was a fact, and the interrogation, what the manual called the first audience, was waiting in a room with no windows. Alonso's journey there was measured in the slow, steady turn of wooden wheels on stone. The system was patient. It had all the time in the world, and it would use every second of it to ask him one relentless question: who else? The secret prison was not a dungeon of dripping stone and rats. It was a room, a square, windowless room in a respectable building near the Madrid Plaza, whitewashed, clean and utterly silent. The door was thick oak, banded with iron. The only furniture was a simple wooden table and two chairs. On the table sat a single candle in a brass holder, a sheaf of papers, an ink pot, and a quill. The flame drew a small, trembling circle of light in the profound dark, leaving the corners of the room to swallow themselves. This was the Sala de Audiencias, the audience chamber. The name was a lie. An audience implies a performance. This was an extraction. Alonso de la Cruz stood before the table. They had taken his cloak. He wore the same clothes from his arrest, now wrinkled and smelling of straw and cold sweat. A guard stood on either side of him, not touching him, their presence a wall of wool and quiet breath. He had been waiting in a holding cell for hours, maybe a day. Time dissolved in the dark. The only measure was the dryness in his throat and the hammering of his own heart. The door opened without a sound. A man entered, closing it softly behind him. He was not old, but he carried an old man's gravity. Inquisitor Don Tomás de Mendoza wore a simple black robe of fine wool, not the coarse cloth of the familiares. His face was pale, long and carefully shaved. His eyes were the color of slate, and they took in Alonso with the dispassionate interest of a clerk reviewing an inventory. He did not introduce himself. His authority was in the robe, in the room, in the very air. Mendoza seated himself. He arranged the papers before him with precise, unhurried movements. He did not look up as he spoke. His voice was a flat, dry monotone, devoid of malice or warmth. It was the sound of a ledger being read. Alonso de la Cruz, resident of the Calle de la Sierpe in Toledo, by trade a mercer. He paused, letting the facts settle like dust. You stand before the tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition on grave suspicion of heresy and apostasy, specifically the crime of Judaizing. He began to read the charges. They were not shouted accusations. They were a dry catalogue of observed behaviors. You have been observed refraining from work on Saturdays. You have been observed changing your linens on Fridays. Witnesses attest you did not eat pork at the public feast of San Martin. You were seen purchasing olive oil from a vendor known to serve conversos. Your wife was heard to murmur a blessing in a form not consistent with Holy Church doctrine. Each charge was a tile in a mosaic Alonso had never meant to assemble. The private rhythm of his home, the habits of his wife's upbringing, the simple preferences of taste, all had been watched, noted, and translated into the language of treason against God. The pressure in that room was not of rage, but of absolute meticulous attention. It was the pressure of a modern high-stakes interrogation or a brutal job interview where every past action is scrutinized, and a single misspoken word carries catastrophic, life-altering consequences. But here, the consequence was not unemployment. It was fire. Mendoza finished reading. He laid the paper down. For the first time, he looked directly at Alonso. The candlelight hollowed his cheeks. "The Holy Mother Church is merciful," he said. "The phrase as rote as a prayer. She seeks not your punishment, but the salvation of your immortal soul. To that end you are offered a singular opportunity. Confess now. Confess fully. Name your errors, repent of them, and name also those who have led you into error, or who have shared in your practices. A full voluntary confession given in this first audience," he gestured to the quill, "will merit great leniency. You may be reconciled with the Church through penance. You may see your family again." The offer hung in the still air. It was a trap wrapped in a promise. Confession meant admitting to crimes against God. It meant branding himself and his bloodline forever. It also meant becoming an informant, turning the Inquisition's gaze onto his cousins, his friends, his own wife, leniency for a chain of new accusations. But denial was a defiance the system could not permit. Alonso's mouth was parched. He thought of Maria's face in the doorway, white with terror. He thought of his children. The urge to say anything, to buy a chance to see them, was a physical pain in his chest, but to confess was to make truth of the lies, to validate the watchers at his window. It would not end with him. It would flow from him like a stain. He found his voice. It was a rasp. "Your Reverence, there is nothing to confess. I am a faithful Christian. I attend Mass. I take the sacraments. These things you read, they are misunderstandings. The witness is mistaken." He had rehearsed the words in the dark cell. They sounded feeble now, hollow as a drum. Mendoza did not react. He showed no disappointment, no anger. He simply watched Alonso for a long moment, his eyes unblinking in the candlelight. The silence stretched, becoming a third presence in the room, heavier than the guards. In that silence, Alonso felt the entire architecture of the Inquisition shift around him. He had chosen the path of resistance, the path of the negativo. Mendoza gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not to Alonso, it was to the guard on his right. "Very well," Mendoza said, his tone unchanged. He gathered his papers, standing up. The audience was over. The mercy was withdrawn. The court will now seek the evidence required to illuminate your conscience. The guard's hand closed around Alonso's upper arm. The grip was firm, impersonal. They turned him toward not the door to the holding cells, but to a different, smaller door in the side wall that Alonso had not noticed. It was low, made of dark, nail-studded timber. Mendoza's final words followed him, calm and definitive. "You will be taken to the Camara de Tormento. There you will be asked the same questions. The methods there are persuasive. All who enter do confess, Señor de la Cruz. The only question is how much of yourself you will leave behind in the process. Consider in the interval if your memory requires refreshing." The low door opened onto a descending stairwell of rough stone. A smell drifted up, a mix of cold earth, rust, and something sour and metallic. The guard propelled Alonso forward into the dark of the stairwell. The last thing he saw was the candle on the table, its tiny flame flickering once, as if in a draft from below, before the door shut behind him with a solid, final thud. The interrogation was over. The questioning was about to begin. The stairwell was not long, but each step downward was a descent into a different kind of silence. The clean, oppressive quiet of the audience chamber was replaced by a dense, damp stillness that swallowed sound. The air grew colder, carrying the mineral tang of deep earth and the faint, acrid scent of old smoke and rust. At the bottom, a short corridor led to a single door of blackened oak, reinforced with broad iron straps. A small grated window at eye level showed only darkness beyond. The guard produced a heavy key. The lock turned with a clunk that echoed too loudly in the confined space. The door swung inward. The Camara de Tormento was not a large room, perhaps 15 feet square, with a vaulted stone ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were rough, unfinished stone, slick in places with a dark, glistening damp. A single torch sputtered in a sconce by the door, its guttering light fighting a losing battle against the gloom, painting everything in a hellish, dancing orange and black. The room was not cluttered with devices. It was almost bare. That was the first thing Alonso's mind seized upon. A stone drain was set into the center of the floor, its iron grate dark. Against the far wall stood a simple wooden table, holding a coiled rope, a bucket, and a folded cloth. And in the middle of the room, suspended from an iron ring bolted into the highest point of the vault, hung a thick new rope with a complicated pulley system. Its end was tied into a noose. 2 men stood waiting. They were not guards. They wore leather aprons over their clothes, stained with dark, blotchy patches. Their sleeves were rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms thick with muscle and old scars. They did not speak. They looked at Alonso with the flat, assessing gaze of butchers surveying a side of beef. The guard who had brought him down pushed Alonso into the center of the room, toward the hanging rope. The other guard remained by the door, a silent sentinel. One of the leather-aproned men stepped forward. His movements were efficient, practiced. Without a word, he began to untie Alonso's wrists. For a wild moment, Alonso felt a surge of hope, a mistake, a reprieve. Then the man took his freed hands and pulled them behind his back again, crossing his wrists. He bound them tightly with a length of coarse cord, the fibers biting into Alonso's skin. The other man approached with a pair of shears. He did not look at Alonso's face. He took hold of Alonso's shirt at the collar and with a few brutal snips cut the garment straight down the back and pulled it away from his torso, leaving him stripped to the waist. The cold of the chamber hit his skin like a slap, raising gooseflesh. The torchlight painted the planes of his chest and back in shifting, anxious light. The first man took the noose end of the rope from the pulley. He did not put it around Alonso's neck. He looped it around Alonso's bound wrists, already pulled behind him, and cinched it tight. The knot was complex, final. He gave a testing tug. The rope went taut, leading up to the pulley and down to a cleat on the wall. Inquisitor Mendoza entered then. He had followed them down. He stood just inside the door, his black robe seeming to drink the torchlight. He held a paper, the list of charges. His expression was unchanged, pale, composed, administrative. "Alonso de la Cruz," he said, his dry voice unnaturally loud in the stone box. "You are again asked, do you confess to the crime of Judaizing? Do you repent and name your accomplices?" Alonso's teeth were beginning to chatter from the cold. He tried to find his voice, the same denial. All that came out was a shaky breath. He shook his head. Mendoza nodded to the man at the wall cleat. The man released the rope. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the slack vanished. The rope snapped tight with a sound like a whip crack. Alonso's arms were wrenched up and back in a single vicious motion. He was lifted clean off his feet, his toes scraping the stone. A white-hot spike of pain shot through his shoulders as his full weight hung from his bound, backward-pulled wrists. A cry was torn from his throat, a raw animal sound that echoed off the stones. This was the strappado, not an engine, not a wheel, just rope, gravity, and the human body's precise limits. He hung there, suspended, the bones of his shoulders grinding in their sockets. The pain was a pure, screaming science. Every second stretched into an eternity of fire along his tendons, of creaking, tearing pressure. He kicked helplessly, trying to find purchase that wasn't there. The torchlight swam in his vision. "Confess," Mendoza said, from what seemed like a great distance. Alonso could not form words. He could only gasp. Mendoza made a small gesture. The man at the cleat let the rope run through his hands. Not a drop, but a controlled, sudden slip. Alonso fell perhaps 18 inches. The rope jerked him to a stop with a brutal, jolting snap. The sound was internal, wet, and sickening. A deep, muffled pop from deep within each shoulder joint. The pain transformed. It was no longer sharp fire. It was a nauseating, overwhelming wave of wrongness, as if his arms were no longer part of him but foreign, agonizing objects attached by shreds of meat. A scream ripped from his throat, long and ragged, that did not sound human even to his own ears. His vision tunneled to a pinpoint of torchlight, then went white. He hung limp now, a dead weight on dislocated limbs. Spittle dripped from his mouth onto the stone below. The instinct to survive, to make the universe stop this single, defining agony, overrode every other thought: loyalty, truth, love, God. It was a biological imperative, as absolute as a hand jerking back from a flame. This is the core of any torture, ancient or digital, the mind's desperate bargain to trade anything: secrets, passwords, lies, names for the cessation of unbearable physical reality. "Who practiced with you?" Mendoza's voice cut through the haze of pain. "Name the heretics." Alonso's head lolled. He tried to remember his children's faces, his wife's voice. They were ghosts, smeared by the blinding pain in his shoulders. The only real things were the cord biting into his ruined wrists, the cold air on his heaving chest, and the promise, the only promise left in the world, that if he spoke, this would stop. He choked on a sob. The name came out, not as a whisper, but as a shattered cry, propelled by agony and the primal need for it to end. "Ramirez," he screamed into the damp dark. "Benito Ramirez, the butcher on the Calle del Ángel." There was a moment of stillness. The only sound was Alonso's ragged, weeping breath. Mendoza did not smile. He turned to a scribe Alonso had not noticed, a small man hunched on a stool in the corner with a tablet on his knee. "Record the confession of Alonso de la Cruz, implicating Benito Ramirez, butcher, in the crime of Judaizing." He then looked back at the hanging man. His voice was almost gentle. "Good. That is a beginning. The Church thanks for its mercy. Now the others." The darkness that took Alonso was not sleep. It was a thick, warm nothingness that swallowed the pain whole. He did not feel the men lower his limp body, nor the rough hands that maneuvered his dangling, useless arms. He did not feel the jarring realignment as they pulled and twisted the shoulders back into their sockets with another wet, grinding pop. The agony was so profound, it had blown out the candle of his consciousness. He awoke on a pallet of damp, moldy straw in a different cell. 3 days had passed. He knew this only because a crust of bread and a clay cup of water sat untouched on the floor, replaced daily. The fever found him first, a deep, bone-shaking chill that made his teeth rattle against the stone wall he huddled against. Then came the fire, burning him up from the inside, painting the dark cell with phantoms of torchlight and the looming shadow of the pulley rope. On the 3rd day the door opened. Inquisitor Mendoza entered, followed by the scribe. The scribe carried a wooden writing desk, a pot of ink, and a single sheet of parchment. Mendoza held nothing. He looked down at Alonso, who shivered in his own filth on the straw, his arms purple and swollen where the cord had bitten, held awkwardly across his chest. "The confession," Mendoza said, not unkindly. "It must be written, then you may rest." The scribe set the desk on the floor. He dipped his quill, poised it over the parchment, and began to read in a rapid nasal monotone. The words swam in Alonso's fevered mind. They spoke of secret Sabbaths observed, of prayers recited in Hebrew he did not know, of contempt for the Holy Sacrament, of leading others, including the butcher Benito Ramirez, into apostasy. It was a biography of a heretic, detailed and damning. It was the story of a man who was not him. "Sign it," Mendoza said. They propped Alonso up against the wall. The scribe placed the quill in his right hand. Alonso's hand trembled violently, a leaf in a storm. The shaking was not from fear alone. It was the tremor of shattered nerves, of a body in systemic revolt. He could not make his fingers obey. He stared at the line at the bottom of the page, a blank space waiting to erase him. The guard behind him grabbed his wrist, a firm clamp that stilled the worst of the shaking. He guided Alonso's hand to the parchment. The nib touched the paper. Alonso tried to form the first letter of his name. A blot of black ink bloomed, a tiny spreading night. "This is the oldest contract sign, under unbearable pressure without understanding the full terms, and watch your life alter in an instant." The guard moved his hand for him, dragging the quill in crude, childlike strokes. ALONSODELACRUZ. It was not a signature. It was a drawing of a name done by a puppet. Mendoza took the document. He sprinkled fine sand over the wet ink, then tipped it off. He produced a small stick of red sealing wax from his robe, lit it with a taper the scribe provided, and let a single fat drop fall onto the parchment beside the ruined signature. Into the soft crimson wax he pressed his signet ring. There was a faint hiss, the smell of beeswax and smoke. The seal was a tiny, perfect imprimatur, the cross and the olive branch of the Holy Office. He did not look at Alonso again. "The auto da fe will be scheduled," he said to the guard, as if discussing a market day. He turned and left, the confession in his hand. The door closed. The lock turned. Alonso de la Cruz slid down the wall onto the straw. The confession was no longer a statement. It was a fact. It existed in the world, separate from him, with its wax seal and its official script. His truth, the truth of a carpenter who went to Mass, loved his family, and knew no Hebrew, was now irrelevant. The paper was real. The paper would speak for him from now on. His fate, his name, his very soul had just been notarized. And the machinery, having secured its input, could now proceed to its next function. The auto de fe was scheduled for a Sunday in May, in the main square of Valladolid. They came for Alonso before dawn. This time there were no hooded familiars, only 2 guards in plain livery. They did not speak as they hauled him up from the straw and walked him, stiff-legged and shuffling, through a series of corridors he had never seen. They emerged not into a courtyard, but into a large bare chamber where morning light bled through high, barred windows. A yellow robe lay folded on a wooden bench, the San Benito. The guards stripped his filthy prison tunic and pulled the penitential garment over his head. The coarse sackcloth scraped his raw skin. It was a simple knee-length tunic, painted front and back with a large red X-shaped cross of St. Andrew, the sign of the reconciled heretic. Then they placed the carroza on his head, a conical hat of the same yellow cloth, over a foot tall. It was circled with painted red devils and dancing flames. The humiliation was precise, systematic. It transformed a man into a symbol, a walking billboard of his own alleged sin. It was public shaming amplified to a citywide scale, a viral cancellation made flesh and cloth. A priest appeared, recited a swift Latin blessing over Alonso's bowed head and departed. The guards then attached a long, heavy rope around his neck. They led him out a heavy oak door and into the cool gray dawn. The city was already awake. Thousands lined the route from the Inquisition Palace to the main plaza. They stood in a silence that was not respectful, but dense and watchful. Alonso saw a sea of faces, men, women, children pressed against each other on balconies, in doorways, at windows. Their eyes were not angry, but intensely curious. He was a spectacle. The rope chafed his neck. The tall carroza made it impossible to hang his head fully. He was forced to look out at the crowd, to let them see the painted devils on his hat. The only sounds were the shuffling of his own bare feet on the cobblestones, the clink of the guards' halberds, and the low guttural murmur of a crowd holding its breath. He passed a woman holding a small child who pointed a tiny finger at his hat. He passed a butcher's stall, closed for the day, the ghost of Benito Ramirez's name hanging in the air between the lines of accusation. The procession moved with a terrible liturgical slowness. This was not a march to punishment, but an exhibition. The purpose was not to hide justice, but to display it, to make the abstract power of the tribunal visible, tangible, and terrifying to every single silent witness. And at the end of this gauntlet of eyes, the plaza awaited, and the platform and the sermon that would last for hours. The real pain was over. What came next was theater. But theater, he would learn, has its own particular and lasting cruelty. The plaza was a solid mass of humanity, a tapestry of wool and linen, and upturned faces stretching from the grandstand of church and royal officials to the very edges of the cobblestones. Alonso was led up the wooden steps of the tablado, the high platform, his carroza wobbling. The sun, now nearing its zenith, beat down on the yellow sackcloth. He was placed in a row with dozens of others, a harvest of penitents in identical San Benitos. To his left was a gaunt man whose robe was painted not with a cross, but with full licking flames and grotesque demons. A San Benito de Fuego, the garment of the unrepentant, destined for the stake. For 3 hours they stood. A Dominican friar mounted a pulpit and delivered a sermon on the perils of heresy, his voice a rolling metallic drone that washed over the crowd and the condemned alike. Alonso's knees trembled. The dislocated ache in his shoulders flared white-hot under the weight of the tall hat. He focused on a single crack in the wooden plank beneath his feet. The ceremony was a meticulously staged drama of power, and every citizen in the square was both audience and participant. Finally, the reading of the sentences began. A secretary stepped forward, unrolled a heavy parchment, and called names in a clear, carrying voice. Each penitent was led forward to the center of the platform. Their confession, the one signed in the dark cell, was read aloud to the silent multitude. Their specific crimes were laid bare: avoiding pork, changing linen on a Friday, whispering Hebrew prayers. Then came the sentence. Alonso heard his name. The guards nudged him forward. The secretary's voice recited the charges of Judaizing, the details pulled from his own tortured confession. The words meant nothing. They were a script written by pain. Then the sentence: reconciliation to the Holy Mother Church, perpetual imprisonment, confiscation of all goods and property. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was not a cheer, but a low exhalation, the sound of a verdict being registered. For Alonso, a dizzying, hollow relief flooded him. He would not burn. He would go back to a cell, to a life of walls and straw, but he would live. It was the desperate, compromised relief of a lesser sentence in a system where the only alternative was fire, a plea deal in a corrupt court, where the bench holds all the cards and the law is merely ceremony. He was led back to his place, his body shaking with a delayed tremor. The ritual, however, required a contrast. The man in the flaming San Benito was called next. His name was Mateo de Silva. He had refused to confess. The secretary read a shorter list of charges, then pronounced the terrible formula: "We relinquish you to the justice and mercy of the secular arm." The church, having washed its hands of the unyielding soul, handed him over to the civil authorities. Their justice was not metaphorical. 2 city constables in different liveries stepped forward and took Mateo by the arms. His face was blank, rigid, as they turned him toward the stairs leading down from the platform. He did not look at the priests. He did not look at the crowd. His gaze was fixed on some point beyond the city walls, where the quemadero, the burning ground, was already prepared with posts and bundles of dry wood. Alonso watched him go. The man who would burn walked with a steadier step than Alonso. The confessed man who would live. It was the final chilling lesson of the spectacle. The system could break you and spare you, or it could break you and consume you, but it would not be defied. The crowd's silence broke into 1,000 whispered judgments as Mateo was led away toward his fate. Alonso, the living prisoner, was then guided down the opposite side of the platform, back toward the shadowed mouth of a waiting street. The last thing he heard from the plaza was not a scream, but the rising, fervent voice of the friar beginning another prayer, sanctifying the terrible theater that would continue until the last sentence was read and the last flame was lit.